We begin in this lecture by examining the goddess Demeter, and we look at Demeter through one of the richest works of literature to survive from the ancient world, the Homeric hymn to Demeter, which tells the story of Demeter's search for her missing daughter Persephone. Now, before I talk about the myth itself, I need to explain what the Homeric hymns are. These are a series of poems in honor of various different gods and goddesses. They range in length from just a few lines to several hundred lines. The Homeric hymn to Demeter is several hundred lines long, in fact. And they're called Homeric because they are written in the same dialect of Greek, using the same poetic meter, dactylic hexameter, and many of the same turns of phrase and vocabulary as we see in the Homeric epics, the Iliad and the Odyssey. The classical Greeks themselves assumed that the Homeric hymns had in fact been written by Homer, the person they believed to have written the Iliad and the Odyssey. Modern scholarship finds it problematic to posit even that one man named Homer wrote the Iliad and the Odyssey, and modern scholars are quite certain that the Homeric hymns were not composed even at the same time as the Iliad or the Odyssey, let alone written by the same author. The hymns, in fact, were composed over a period of several centuries. The earliest one may well be the Homeric hymn to Demeter. It's certainly one of the earliest. It was probably written down between 650 and 550 BC. So they're called Homeric because they're written in the style of Homer. They're called hymns, which originally in Greek just meant songs. They happen to be songs in honor of various gods and goddesses. And the longer Homeric hymns in particular are very useful for understanding the essential nature of the deities to which they're dedicated, because they tend to tell a story that is in some way key for understanding the nature of the god whom they honor. So the Homeric hymn to Demeter tells the story of Demeter's search for her missing daughter Persephone. Now, the work is important not just because it's a beautiful poem from a relatively early era of Greek literature. It's also important because the myth it recounts, the story of Persephone's abduction by Hades, god of the underworld, and Demeter's search for her, is open to a great variety of interpretations. It's a very fruitful myth to look at from all sorts of angles. And mainly because it deals with those important questions again. Questions of gender roles, of sexuality, of marriage customs, the relative power of different deities, what Demeter can and cannot accomplish to rescue her daughter, and last but by no means least, the hymn touches on the whole issue of human mortality, of human death, and how we approach death. In addition, the myth of Persephone's abduction and Demeter's search for her is one of the very few myths preserved in ancient literature that has a clear and direct connection with a specific ritual where we know what the ritual was, at least more or less we know what the ritual was, and we can see how the myth interacts with it. The ritual in question in this case is a ceremony held in honor of Demeter at Eleusis, a town near Athens. The ceremony was called the Eleusinian Mysteries. It was one of the most important religious festivals of ancient Greece, and we'll talk about it in detail in the next lecture. Finally, the Homeric hymn to Demeter preserves one of the most clearly and transparently etiological of all surviving myths. As I mentioned in a previous lecture, Persephone's disappearance into the underworld and reappearance for 2/3 of each year, during which time grain grows, while the grain is gone when she's in the underworld, that very clearly serves as an explanation or an etiology for the seasons, for why grain does not grow during a portion of the year. So this one myth encapsulates all sorts of angles on myth, in itself an interesting and compelling story. Now, the basic story of Persephone's abduction by Hades is fairly simple. Demeter, again, the goddess of grain and agriculture, had a single daughter, Persephone. Persephone's father was Zeus, so Zeus and Demeter mated once and produced a daughter, Persephone. With Zeus's permission, Hades, god of the underworld, comes out of Hades, out of Tartaros one day, seizes Persephone as she's picking flowers in a field, and takes her down to Tartaros with him to be his bride. This is one of the very few times in myth when Hades actually leaves Tartaros and comes back to the world of the living. He does so to get Persephone. Demeter does not know what's happened to her daughter. She wanders the world looking for Persephone. During her wanderings, she visits the town of Eleusis near Athens. Eventually, Demeter forces Zeus's hand to try to get Persephone back by causing a famine, refusing to let any grain grow. If the famine continues, all humankind will die out, and therefore Zeus strikes a bargain between Hades and Demeter so that humanity will not starve to death. Zeus begins by ordering Hades to return Persephone permanently. However, while Persephone was in Tartaros, she ate a seed of a pomegranate, and this means she can't leave Tartaros permanently. The idea apparently is that if you eat a substance while you're in the underworld, you have to stay in the underworld. So the compromise that's reached under Zeus's mediation is that Persephone will spend 1/3 of the year in Hades, in Tartaros with her husband Hades, and 2/3 of the year on Olympus with her mother Demeter. That's the basic storyline, but there is much more going on in this basic story than is immediately obvious. As told in the Homeric hymn to Demeter, Demeter's search for Persephone tells us a great deal about, or a better way to put it might be, reflects in great detail various aspects of ancient Greek life, or perhaps it would be more accurate at this point to say of ancient Athenian life. That's something I haven't really mentioned in detail yet, but when we talk about ancient Greek culture, that's really a rather inaccurate expression. We would probably normally be better off saying ancient Athenian culture. Because of all the ancient city-states in Greece, Athens is the one about which we know out and away the most, and the bulk of ancient Greek literature that has survived to the present day comes from Athens, as does the Homeric hymn to Demeter. So it's probably safer to say that the Homeric hymn to Demeter gives us insight onto several important aspects of Athenian life, rather than to say Greek life in general. First, it reflects quite clearly actual Greek marriage practices. A marriage in Athens was a contract between the groom and the bride's father. It was a business transaction almost, undertaken by two males, in which the girl was simply the object that was exchanged between the two males. The girl did not have to consent to the marriage. Her consent was not necessary. There was no legal or social requirement, I suppose, that she even had to be told ahead of time that she was going to be married. Now, we can hope that most human fathers did at least tell their wives and tell their daughters that they were arranging a marriage for the daughter in question. Zeus is giving Persephone to Hades without even telling Demeter that this is going to happen is a bit extreme, but it's an extreme of normal practice. The idea that the marriage is arranged between Zeus and Hades rather than Hades asking Persephone, would you like to marry me? That's completely normal. Secondly, Persephone marries her own uncle. Now, we've seen a lot of incest already among the gods. Zeus marries his sister, Demeter is Zeus's sister, and so forth. But this, the marriage of a girl to her uncle, to her father's brother, would not be considered incest in ancient Athens. In fact, when a man had only daughters, when he had no male heirs, it was not only appropriate, it was considered necessary that his eldest daughter marry his closest male relative, which normally meant the father's brother, i.e. her own uncle. Such a girl was called an epikleros. There was a particular term for her. An epikleros was a daughter who was her father's heir. And yet, legally speaking, women could not inherit property in ancient Athens. Now, a man wanted his property to remain within his family. Normally, he would hand it down to his sons. A woman can't hold property in her own right. If she marries outside her family, then the family's property goes to another family. That is considered unacceptable. So what do you do in this case? You marry the girl to the father's nearest male relative, normally her uncle, and therefore the property stays within her direct male family. So Persephone is acting as an epikleros when she's married off to her own uncle. She is the only child of the union between Demeter and Zeus, though of course she's not Zeus's only child in general. Another point that's worth making in this context is that human marriages in Athens and elsewhere in Greece as well were patrilocal. What that means is that the bride moved in with her husband's family. Now, I'm always interested at students' reactions when I say that, because so often I get the reaction of, well, of course, or that's only natural, or something along those lines. It's not natural. Nothing about marriage customs is natural. They're all constructed by cultures. The reason we tend to find the idea that the bride goes to join her husband's family rather than vice versa natural is because that's the same system that we still have in our culture. That's why most American brides take their husband's names. Not all of us do, but most do, because we see marriage as a woman joining the husband's family, not vice versa. There have been cultures in which marriage means that a man joins his wife's family. But in ancient Athens, marriage was definitely patrilocal. So Persephone's being taken to the underworld is a rather severe example of that, but again, it's part of normal practice. Now, the reason I stress that, the reason this is important, is because in Athenian society, the patrilocal nature of marriage meant that human mothers and daughters would have greatly restricted contact after the daughter was married. Athenian women, at least Athenian women of the middle and upper classes, were not supposed to leave their homes. They stayed inside, they were sequestered. They went out of their homes normally only for family funerals and for a few religious festivals per year. This means, if you think about it, that if a daughter moved more than a very short distance indeed away from her family home upon her marriage, she and her mother would quite likely never or almost never see unusual things about this myth. In it, we see Demeter grieving for her daughter who is, in effect, dead. Now, that needs a little bit of explanation, perhaps. Why doesn't Demeter simply go to Tartaros to see Persephone? The answer to that is that Olympians can't, or at least don't, go to Tartaros. Hades is an exception because in the triple division he was given Tartaros as his domain, so he for the most part stays there and rules over Tartaros. Hermes is the only real exception to this rule. Hermes is a god we'll talk about in a later lecture. He's the messenger of the gods, among other things, but he's also the god who conducts the souls of dead humans to their new abode in Tartaros. So Hermes can cross into Tartaros and come back out again. But aside from that, Olympians normally cannot go to Tartaros. Persephone is there only because Hades has bodily taken her there as his bride. So the assumption that Demeter makes when she hears where Persephone is, Helios, the god of the sun, tells Demeter where Persephone is, because from his vantage point in the sky, he's seen her abduction. Demeter's assumption is that Persephone is gone, is lost. And Demeter's reaction is very much like a human being's reaction at the death of a loved one. She even goes through some gestures, tearing her robe and so forth, that would normally be gestures a human being would do while grieving for the death of a loved one. So in Demeter's reaction to Persephone's disappearance, we have the only time that we see a god or goddess in effect mourning the death of another god or goddess. So Demeter has lost her daughter to marriage, and she's lost her daughter to at least the land of death, if not death itself. This underlines a symbolic connection that we see in a great deal of Greek literature between marriage and death. In part, that's probably because those are two great transition periods in